The station smelled like rust and fear. It hung in space like a dead eye, massive, gray, and cold, orbiting a star that had been slowly dying for 1,000 years. The Ketherok called it the Holding. Everyone else called it something they could not say out loud, without their voice shaking. Inside, behind walls of thick transparent alloy, hundreds of beings sat in their containment blocks and waited. Some had been waiting for years, some had stopped counting. The blocks were stacked in long rows, floor to ceiling, like shelves in a warehouse. Because that is exactly what it was, a warehouse. The Ketherok did not destroy what they conquered. They stored it. Species from 17 star systems were crammed into those blocks. There were the Vorhai, tall, thin beings with pale blue skin, who had once controlled 3 trade routes before the hegemony swallowed them whole. There were the Shaleth, ancient, slow-moving creatures covered in dark, ridged shells, who had been here longer than anyone else. There were smaller species, too, ones whose names most of the galaxy had already forgotten, sitting quietly in corners, staring at nothing. And then there were the humans. 47 of them, spread across 6 containment blocks near the east wall. They had arrived 3 weeks ago, brought in after the ambush at the Kepler relay. The Ketherok ships had come out of nowhere, or that is how it seemed. The 3rd Human Expeditionary Force had been escorting a supply convoy when the attack hit. It was fast and precise. The humans had fought back hard, harder than the Ketherok had expected, but in the end, the numbers were not in their favor. 47 survivors had been taken, the rest were gone. Staff Sergeant Darian Voss sat near the front of his block, his back straight, his eyes moving slowly around the room. He was not a large man by any dramatic standard. Medium height, lean, with short dark hair, and a calm face that gave very little away. He had a habit of sitting very still, not the stillness of someone who had given up, but the stillness of something that was always, quietly, paying attention. He had already counted the guards. 6 per shift. They rotated every 4 hours. The one near the south corridor always stopped to adjust his equipment around the 2nd hour. A small habit that created a window of distraction lasting about 20 seconds. The power conduits for the containment blocks ran along the ceiling and fed into a hub near the main door. The emergency bulkhead was 30 meters away. The magnetic locks on the blocks required a handheld key that the guards kept on their left side. He had noted all of this in the first 2 days. He had said nothing about it to anyone yet. The alien prisoners around him had noticed the humans early on. Hard not to. Humans were strange in ways that were difficult to explain. They talked more than other species. They laughed sometimes, even here, which the other prisoners found deeply unsettling. They slept lightly and woke fast. They did small things with their hands constantly, tapping fingers, stretching joints, running thumb across knuckle. Restless. Always restless, like creatures that had been built for movement and were badly unhappy with being made to stay still. An elderly Shaleth in the block next to Darian's had watched the humans for several days before finally speaking. His name was Arath. He was somewhere around 400 years old, and had seen things that would have broken most minds. "You are from Earth?" he asked, his voice slow and deep, like stone settling. "That's right," Darian said. "I have heard of your world. They say it is a violent place. It has its moments." Arath was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Vrethkal comes on the 3rd day of every cycle. He does what he calls his walk. You will want to keep your head down. Look at the floor. Do not meet his eyes. Do not speak. What happens if someone does?" The old Shaleth turned his great ridged head slowly toward the ceiling, as if looking for an answer written somewhere up there. The last being who met his eyes was a young Vorhai male. He had spirit. He believed it would matter. Arath paused. It did not matter. He is in the lower blocks now. He does not speak anymore. Darian nodded slowly. "Thanks for the warning." Arath looked at him carefully. "You will follow it?" Darien did not answer. The third day came. The doors at the far end of the processing bay opened with a long hydraulic hiss, and Commander Vrethkal walked in. He was enormous, 8 feet tall, covered in dark-scaled armor that fit his body like a second skin. He had 4 arms, the upper 2, thick and built for strength, the lower 2 quicker and used more for expression and gesture. His head was crowned with a ridge of spines that glowed faintly, blue when he was calm, a deep red when he was not. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if the floor existed purely as a stage for him. His 2 guards flanked him at a respectful distance. Every alien prisoner in the room responded the same way. They drew back from the fronts of their blocks. They lowered their eyes. The room became very quiet, in the way a forest becomes quiet when something dangerous passes through. Vrethkal walked the rows. He stopped occasionally, looking at a prisoner with flat, assessing eyes, saying nothing. Once or twice he made a low sound in his throat, a sound that translated roughly to acceptable, as if reviewing inventory, as if deciding what was worth keeping. He reached the humans. He stopped. He looked at them the way someone looks at something they do not quite recognize. His spines shifted color slightly. Then he moved to Darien's block, raised one heavy hand, and opened it. Darien stood. He did not look at the floor. Vrethkal studied him for a long moment. The translator chip in Darien's ear picked up a murmur from one of the guards, something about the human not showing proper posture. Vrethkal's lower right arm rose slowly. There was nothing fast or dramatic about what happened next. It was completely casual. A slow, open-handed strike across Darien's face. Not a punch, not a strike meant to injure, just a slap. The kind of gesture you make to remind something that it is small. The sound of it carried across the whole bay. Every prisoner in the room went absolutely still. The Vorhai looked away. The smaller species pressed to the backs of their blocks. Erath closed his ancient eyes. Vrethkal lowered his hand and waited. He was waiting for what always came next. The flinch, the step back, the lowered head. Sometimes there were tears. Sometimes there was a sound, a low, broken sound that meant something inside had just cracked open. He had done this walk for 11 years, and it always ended the same way. Submission, defeat, the quiet proof that he was the most powerful thing in the room. He waited. Darien Voss turned his head back slowly. He looked directly at Vrethkal. There was a thin line of blood at the corner of his mouth. He did not raise a hand to it. He did not blink more than he needed to. His breathing did not change. He smiled, not a wide smile, not a nervous smile, a small, steady smile, the kind that sits on a face like it belongs there, like it has been sitting there for a while. Erath, who had kept his eyes closed, heard nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he heard something he had not expected. He opened his eyes. The commander's spines had shifted to a deep, vivid red, and Darien Voss was still standing. Later, the survivors would be asked to describe what they saw. They would struggle, not because they lacked words, but because what happened in those 5 seconds did not match anything in their experience. They had frameworks for violence. They had all seen violence. They had frameworks for anger, for desperation, for the wild and panicked strikes of a cornered creature. They did not have a framework for what Darien Voss did. It was not wild. It was not panicked. It was not even angry, not in any way they recognized. It was simply fast and certain, like something that had already decided. The first second began the moment Darien's head turned back. Inside his body, things were already happening that had nothing to do with conscious thought. The human nervous system, built across millions of years on a planet that had never once been gentle, did not wait for instruction. The strike had registered as threat. The body had already begun its response before his mind had finished forming an opinion about the situation. Adrenaline moved through his blood like a switch being thrown in a dark building. Lights coming on, one after another, fast. His heart rate climbed. The muscles in his legs and arms filled with blood. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, began to close. His vision sharpened. The edges of the room softened, and Vrethkal filled his entire focus. 8 feet of scaled armor, and 4 arms, and a crest that was burning red. Darian saw the width of the throat, the gap between the upper and lower arms, the slight forward lean of the commander's weight. He saw it all, in less than a second, the way a person who has spent years training for close combat sees a room. Not as a place, but as a set of distances and angles and options. Vrethkal had not moved. He was still waiting for the submission that had always, without exception, come. The second. Darian's right foot shifted. Not a step, just a small adjustment of weight, moving it forward by a few centimeters. To his 2 guards, who were standing several meters away and watching with the bored eyes of men who had seen this routine 100 times, it looked like the human was simply steadying himself. Arath saw it. The old Shalith had opened his eyes again and was watching with the sharp attention of a creature who had survived 4 centuries by learning to read the moment before a moment. He saw the foot shift. He saw the way Darian's shoulders settled, not dropping in defeat, but dropping in the specific way that shoulders drop when a body is about to commit to something. He had seen it once before, a very long time ago, in a very different place. He had been young then. He had seen a cornered animal make that same small movement before it stopped being cornered. He pressed himself to the back wall of his block. The other alien prisoners nearest to Darian's block did not see the foot. They were still looking at their floors, still performing the careful, necessary act of not being noticed. But something reached them anyway. Something that did not travel through eyes or ears. Something older. The part of every living creature that exists below thought, below language, below even fear. The part that simply knows when the temperature of a room has changed. Their bodies responded before their minds did. They leaned back. They made themselves small. Not because they had decided to, because something in them said very quietly and very clearly, move away from that. The 3rd second. Darian stood up straight. It was such a simple thing. He just stood, fully, without apology, without the forward hunch that most prisoners developed after their first week. That unconscious folding inward, as if making yourself smaller would make the weight of the place press down less hard. He stood the way a person stands when they have decided that the ground under their feet belongs to them. Vrethkal's expression did not change, but his lower arms, which had been hanging loosely at his sides after delivering the strike, began to rise, slowly, the way hands rise when the mind has not yet registered danger, but the body has started to. Once. One of his guards took a single step forward, hand moving toward the restraint tool at his belt. He did not get a second step. The 4th second. Darian's hand came up and closed around Vrethkal's throat. Not the jaw, not the chest where armor plating covered everything vital. The throat. The one place on a Ketharok body where the neck was exposed, where the scale armor had a gap for the articulation of the head. He had seen it the moment Vrethkal walked in. He had filed it away, the same way he had filed away the guard rotations and the power conduits and the distance to the bulkhead. Information. Stored. Waiting. His grip locked. Years of zero-gravity combat training had built a particular kind of strength in human hands, not the blunt, crushing strength of brute force, but a precise mechanical grip that once it found its position did not release. Vrethkal's own considerable strength was irrelevant to this. All 4 of his arms came up at once, grabbing at Darian's wrist, his arm, his shoulder. They could not break the grip. Then the psionic pulse hit. It came out of Vrethkal's crest like a wave, a scream that did not travel through air, but through the mind directly. Every being in the room felt it. The Vorhai nearest to the blast collapsed against their walls, hands pressed to their heads. Several of the smaller species simply fell down. Even Aroth, 400 years old and harder than most, made a low sound and shut his eyes tight against a sudden, massive pressure behind them. Darien flinched. Just once. A single brief tightening around his eyes, as if someone had shone a bright light in his face. Then it passed, and his grip did not loosen by a single degree. There was a reason for this that no one in the room understood at the time, though it would be discussed and studied and written about extensively in the years that followed. The human mind is not quiet. It never has been. It runs constantly, worrying, remembering, anticipating, second-guessing, looping back over old conversations and forward into imagined futures. It carries noise, the way some planets carry storms, perpetually, as a basic condition of existing. When the psionic pulse hit Darien's mind, it found a place already so full of its own turbulence that the external signal had nowhere to land. It was like trying to shout at someone through a speaker that was already turned up all the way. The signal got lost in the static. Vrethkal's spines went from red to a color that had no calm name in his language. A deep, pulsing white that his species only produced in one specific situation: terror. The 5th second. One movement, precise, practiced. The kind of movement that doesn't come from anger or hate or any emotion at all, but purely from 10,000 hours of training that had built the motion into muscle and bone until it no longer required thought. Darien Voss turned his hips, used the rotation of his full body, and completed what he had started. Vrethkal's crest hit the floor first. It shattered against the hard metal, and the bioluminescent glow flickered once, erratically, like a light going out. And then it was still. The room was silent. Not the careful silence of prisoners keeping their heads down. A different kind of silence. A silence that falls when something happens that everyone present knows they will be trying to explain for the rest of their lives. Darien stood where he was, breathing steadily, and looked at the two guards. They did not move. In the blocks around him, slowly, one by one, alien faces turned. They had been looking away. Now they looked. They looked at the floor. They looked at Darien. They looked at each other. Arath opened his eyes. He looked at Darien for a long moment. Then he looked down at the tracking band on his wrist, the one the Ketharak had locked there on the day he arrived, 11 years ago. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have stopped believing they could ever remove. His old, slow hands moved to it, and for the first time in 11 years, he started to pull. The Ketharak hegemony had made one very specific mistake that day, and it had nothing to do with the slap. The slap was the trigger, but the mistake, the one that would take the hegemony years to fully understand, had been made 3 hours before Vrethkal ever walked into the processing bay. That was when the broadcast began. Every cycle, the hegemony's propaganda division streamed Vrethkal's dominance walk live across the state network. It went out to every occupied system, every border station, every colony world that the hegemony had folded into itself over the past 3 centuries. The message was always the same, and it did not need words. It just needed the image, their commander, walking slowly through a room full of conquered beings, and those beings doing exactly what conquered things were supposed to do. Looking down, staying small, confirming simply by their behavior that the Ketharak were inevitable. It was very effective propaganda. It had been running for 11 years. That day an estimated 430 million beings across 17 star systems were watching. They saw the slap. Then they waited for what always came next. It did not come. What happened instead was broadcast live, in full, with perfect clarity, to every screen and every feed connected to the hegemony network. Vrethkal's crest hitting the floor, the 2 guards standing completely still, the human standing over the commander's body, breathing steadily, looking at no one in particular. The reaction across the galaxy did not happen all at once. It moved in waves, the way a stone dropped in water moves. The first ripple close and immediate, the later ones wider and slower. In the Ketherok High Council chambers, 3 systems away, there was a moment of complete, stunned silence. The councilors sat around their long curved table, staring at the feed. One of them, an older female named Vressa, who had served on the council for 40 years and had never once, in all that time, felt the specific sensation she was feeling right now, looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to the communications officer beside her and said, very quietly, "Kill the broadcast." The communications officer's hands were already moving. "Counselor, it has already gone to the relay stations. We cannot pull it back from the outer systems. The signal, then cut it now. Whatever we can cut, cut it." They cut it. But by then, the clip had been running for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. On a network that spanned 17 star systems, 4 minutes and 17 seconds was more than enough. Far across the network, in the deep cluster where the Vorhai Collective lived, in whatever was left of their autonomy, the feed cut out mid-clip. The Vorhai sat with dead screens and looked at each other in the quiet of their shared halls. They were a species that communicated partly through chemical signals, subtle things, impossible for outsiders to detect, that carried emotion like words carry meaning. For a long moment after the screen went dark, no chemical signal moved through the room at all. Then someone, no one ever knew who, and the Vorhai themselves were not sure it was deliberate, released a small, involuntary trace of the signal that in their language meant something close to, "I did not know that was possible." It spread through the room, then through the building, then through the district, slow and unstoppable, the way a smell travels. Within an hour, the entire Vorhai Collective had it, that single quiet realization, shared between millions of minds, none of whom had a word for what they were feeling yet, but all of whom understood it the same way. In a small listening post on the edge of explored space, a cold, cramped station staffed by 6 people whose job was mostly to monitor signal traffic and write reports that rarely reached anyone important, 2 analysts sat in front of a screen. One of them was a young woman named Sarah, 26 years old, 18 months into her posting, who had spent most of those months wishing she had applied for a different assignment. She was holding a cup of coffee that she had poured 11 minutes ago, and not yet taken a single sip from. The other was her senior partner, an older man named Tobias, who had worked signals intelligence for 20 years, and prided himself on being impossible to surprise. They had picked up the broadcast on a passive monitor, almost by accident. They had been watching it for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When the screen cut to black, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Tobias reached over, very carefully, and moved his hand to the emergency uplink panel. He flipped the cover open. Underneath it was a single red switch that he had tested once, during a drill, but never actually used. He put his hand on it. "Sarah," he said. "Yeah?" "Log the timestamp. Log everything we just saw. Full record." "Already doing it." "Good." He threw the switch, because Fleet Command is going to want to see this inside the next 10 minutes. Back on the holding, inside the processing bay, the guards had still not moved. Darien had not moved either. He stood where he was, calm and still, and simply waited to see what would happen next. It was not bravado. It was a practical decision. Sudden movement was more likely to trigger a response than stillness. He had learned that in training, and he had confirmed it in every difficult situation he had ever been in since. The other humans in the nearby blocks had pressed forward to the fronts of their containment walls. They were watching him with expressions that mixed worry and something else, something that was not quite pride, but lived near it. The alien prisoners were not looking at the floor anymore. They were looking at Darien, and they were looking at the guards, and they were measuring the same things Darien had been measuring since the day he arrived. Distances, angles, the gap between a guard's hand and the key at his belt. Eroth had not gotten the tracking band off. His fingers were old, and the locking mechanism was stiff. But he was still trying. Slowly, methodically, without any particular urgency, because he had learned long ago that urgency made the hands shake, and the hands needed to be steady. He worked at it the way he had worked at difficult things all his long life. Steadily, patiently, like something that had finally decided it had waited long enough. The guard nearest to Darian's block looked at his partner. His partner looked back. Between them passed the specific, uncomfortable communication of two beings who had been given a very clear set of rules for a situation that had just, completely, and without warning, stopped being the situation those rules were written for. Neither of them reached for their weapon. Somewhere in the station's walls, a pipe groaned. The old star outside shifted slightly in its long, slow dying. The lights in the bay hummed their constant, empty hum. And in 17 star systems, on screens that were still lit or had just gone dark, 430 million beings sat with what they had seen and turned it over in their minds, quietly, the way you turn over something you found on the ground that you cannot quite identify but cannot quite put back down either. The galaxy had been watching the Ketharak for 300 years. For the first time, it had seen something watch back. Darian Voss had not planned a revolution. He wanted to be clear about that, later, when people asked. He had not stood in his containment block and decided that today was the day everything changed. He had not been waiting for the right moment to strike a blow for humanity, or for freedom, or for any of the large important things that people would later write about in connection with his name. He had been slapped. He had responded. That was the complete and honest truth of it, and he saw no reason to dress it up into something more dramatic than it was. But the thing about a myth, once it breaks, is that you do not get to choose how far the pieces fall. The station fell in 6 hours. It did not fall because Darian Voss was a superhero. It fell because of what he had done, and what everyone had seen, and what that had unlocked in 400 and some odd prisoners, who had until 4 minutes ago believed without any real doubt that the Ketharak were permanent. Not just powerful, not just dangerous, permanent. The way weather is permanent. The way gravity is permanent. You don't fight gravity, you simply live within it, and try not to fall too hard. That belief had been the real chain, not the tracking bands, not the containment blocks, not the guards and their weapons. The belief. Darian had not broken the belief on purpose, but it was broken now, and what came after moved fast. The first thing that happened was the guards. The two in the bay had still not acted, when the Vorhai in the nearest blocks, 3 of them, hit their containment walls at the same time from the inside. The walls were strong. They were built to hold species far physically larger than the Vorhai. But the locking mechanism on the blocks was not in the wall. It was in the small panel beside each block, operated by the guard's key. One of the Vorhai had understood this for months. He had just never believed that understanding it mattered. He believed it now. He called out to the guard, and what he said was so unexpected, so completely outside the range of things prisoners said, that the guard actually turned toward him out of pure reflex. That was all the time the second Vorhai needed to reach through the ventilation gap at the base of the block and grab the guard's ankle. The guard went down. The key skidded across the floor. A human hand came through the base gap of Darian's block and picked it up before it stopped moving. After that it moved fast, in the way that complicated things. Once they tip, always move fast. The other guards came running, and they ran into 47 humans who had been sitting still for 3 weeks, with a great deal of built-up energy, and very clear ideas about what they wanted to do with it. The fight through the processing bay lasted less than 8 minutes. It was not a clean fight. It was not a heroic fight. It was a hard, close, ugly fight, in a confined space, the kind that left everyone bruised and some people bleeding. But when it ended, the bay was in human and prisoner hands, and the guards were locked in the blocks they had spent years maintaining. Darian found the station's internal map on a guard's handheld. He passed it to a human corporal named Yates, who had done more station infiltration training than anyone else in the group, and said 3 words: "Find the bridge." Yates found the bridge. It took 4 more hours, 3 more fights, 2 broken ribs for a private named Okonkwo, who kept going anyway, and 1 extraordinarily tense standoff in a corridor near the engineering section, that ended only when Arath, who had finally gotten his tracking band off, and was moving with them by then, spoke to the Ketharak engineer blocking their path in the engineer's own dialect, very quietly, for about 30 seconds. The engineers stepped aside. No one asked Arath what he had said. They moved through. The station fell. By the time the holding's emergency beacon reached the nearest Ketharak fleet position, 47 humans and 312 alien former prisoners were in control of the station, had locked down the remaining Ketharak personnel in their own detention level, and had broadcast a signal on the open band that simply said in 12 languages, "The holding is open. Come and leave if you can." The signal reached Terran Alliance Fleet Command 11 minutes after Tobias and Sarah's emergency uplink, which meant that by the time the admirals were still reading the first report, the second one was already arriving. An officer named Commander Hiresh, who ran the overnight watch at Fleet Command's Deep Space Division and was known for being calm under pressure, read both reports in sequence, set them down, and then picked up the direct line to the office of Admiral Chen. The Admiral answered on the second ring. "You've seen the reports," Hiresh said. "I'm looking at them now." "The Threshold Protocol, Admiral." There was a pause on the line. The Threshold Protocol was a military response plan that had existed in theory for years. A plan for what humanity would do if it ever had genuine cause to move against the hegemony directly. It had been written, reviewed, updated, and filed away. And most of the people who knew about it privately believed it would sit in that file forever. Not because humanity was not capable, but because the moment to use it had never clearly arrived. "How long ago did this happen?" Chen asked. "The incident on the station, approximately 4 hours. The clip has been on the open network for most of that. It has been viewed, by our current estimate, by close to 1 billion beings." Another pause. 1 billion. Approximately. The number is still rising. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Admiral Chen said, "Threshold. Authorize it." 17 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, within striking distance of Ketharak border systems, over the next 9 hours. They did not threaten. They simply appeared and held their positions, and broadcast on the hegemony's own emergency frequency a message that was brief, clear, and written by someone who understood that when you have just seen your enemy kill a commander with their bare hands in front of 1 billion witnesses, this is not the time for complicated language. The message said, "We will discuss terms, or we will not. Your choice." In the Ketharak High Council chambers, Councillor Vressa had not left the building since the broadcast. She had not slept. She had spent hours reading everything the hegemony's intelligence division had ever compiled on humanity, and she was beginning to understand, with the slow and terrible clarity of someone who has been wrong about something important for a very long time, exactly how wrong the hegemony had been. The files were full of data. Planet of origin, harsh high gravity, extreme climate variation, evolutionary history, predators, prey, competition for resources across millions of years on a world that had produced more varied and dangerous life than almost anywhere else in the catalogued galaxy. Military history. She had read this section 3 times, and it disturbed her more each time. Not because of the scale of it, though the scale was considerable, but because of the pattern. Humans fought each other constantly, across their entire recorded history. And then, without entirely stopping, they also kept getting better at it. Each conflict seemed to produce refinements, new methods, new technologies, new strategies that were absorbed and built upon and carried forward. They never lost the information. They kept all of it. She pulled up a secondary file, cultural analysis, literature, mythology, She scrolled through it, looking for the common themes. What did humans tell themselves stories about? Monsters, mostly. Creatures more powerful than a single human, which the human then found a way to defeat. She thought about Vrethkal's crest on the floor of the processing bay. She closed the file. She looked at the report from the border systems, where 17 human warships were sitting like a question waiting for an answer. We slapped the wrong species, she said. The war did not last long. That surprised many people. Most species that had watched the hegemony for any length of time had assumed that if conflict between the Ketharak and humanity ever properly ignited, it would burn for generations. The Ketharak were not weak. They had 3 centuries of conquest behind them, a fleet that spanned 17 systems, and a military that had never, in all that time, been decisively beaten. But the Ketharak High Council was, above all else, practical. They looked at the data. They looked at it carefully with fresh eyes, stripping away the comfortable assumptions they had carried for so long that those assumptions had stopped feeling like assumptions and had started feeling like facts. They looked at what humanity had done on the holding with 47 people, no weapons, and no plan. They looked at the speed with which the Terran Alliance had mobilized. They looked at the faces of the alien peoples who had been held in hegemony stations and colonies and controlled territories, millions of beings who had watched that clip, who were watching it still, who were doing something the hegemony's own social analysts described in their reports, using words like awakening and reorganizing, and in one honest report filed by a junior analyst who would later say she had not expected anyone to read it, hoping. The hegemony had ruled through the absence of hope. It had spent 300 years carefully and systematically removing from every conquered people the belief that things could be different. It had been very effective. And then one human in 5 seconds on a live stream had put that belief back. You cannot put that back in a box once it is out. The council made its decision. Not surrender. They did not call it surrender. But they reached out through the neutral channels, made contact with the Terran Alliance's diplomatic division, and used a word that the hegemony had not used in 3 centuries of dealing with other species. They asked to talk. 6 months later, at a large neutral station at the edge of contested space, a place called the Amari Crossroads, which had been used for treaty negotiations by a dozen species over its long history, the talks happened. The station was crowded, not just with the official delegations, but with observers. The Vorhai had sent representatives. So had the Shaleth and the Mreth diaspora, and 7 other peoples who had spent years or decades or generations under hegemony control, and had never in that time been invited to sit at any table. They were sitting now. The room had been expanded twice to fit everyone who had a right to be there. And there was some quiet argument about whether the table was long enough. And in the end, the table was replaced with a large circular arrangement that had no head and no foot, and no implicit hierarchy of position, which was itself considered a significant statement by everyone present. The Terran Alliance delegation was led by Ambassador Lena Marsh, a woman who had spent 30 years in diplomatic work and had a reputation for being very patient and very hard to rattle. She had a small team with her, advisors, translators, legal experts, and Darian Voss. He was not part of the official team. He held no diplomatic title. He had been given no role or function in the proceedings. Ambassador Marsh had simply called him 3 weeks before the talks and said, "I would like you to be in that room." When he asked why, she had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Because they need to see that you exist." He had thought about it and said he would come. He sat near the back of the human section, in plain clothes, with no rank visible, and nothing that identified him to someone who did not already know. He sat the way he always sat, straight, still, paying attention. The Ketharak delegation arrived. There were 6 of them, in formal dress, their crests held in the neutral pale gold that indicated ceremonial composure. They took their seats without looking at the human section. Then, slowly, almost as one, they looked. Their eyes found Darien. He was not hard to find. He had a particular quality of stillness that drew attention the way a quiet sound draws the ear in a noisy room. He met their eyes without expression. Not aggressively, not coldly, just directly. The way a person looks at something they are comfortable looking at. Two of the Ketharak delegation looked away first. Ambassador Marsh, who noticed everything, said nothing about this. The talks were long. 3 days of careful, detailed, sometimes difficult negotiation, with long nights between sessions during which every side retreated to its own quarters to argue internally about what the other side had said and what it meant and what was worth pushing on. There were moments of real tension. The questions of reparations, of territory, of the status of the occupied peoples were not easy questions, and nobody pretended they were. There were moments of unexpected agreement, too, where something that had seemed impossibly far apart turned out, when the translators found the right words, to be less far apart than either side had thought. On the morning of the third day, Darien passed the Shalit elder, Erath, in the corridor outside the main hall. Erath was moving slowly, as he always did, his ancient shell reflecting the station's overhead lights. He stopped when he saw Darien. They had not spoken since the holding. There had not been a natural moment for it. The months between had been full of debriefings and movement, and the machinery of large events grinding forward. Erath looked at him for a moment. Then he said in his slow, deep voice, "I did not think I would see this room." "Neither did I," Darien said. "I have seen a great many things in 4 centuries," Erath said. "I have learned not to be surprised by cruelty. I did not think I had any more capacity to be surprised by its opposite. I was wrong about that." He moved past, slowly, into the hall. The treaty was signed that afternoon. It was not a perfect document. No treaty that covers the level of history they were trying to cover is ever a perfect document. But it stopped the expansion. It secured the release of every being held in every hegemony containment station. It gave the Vorhai back 2 of their 3 trade routes. It gave the Shalith back their home system, which they had not seen in 11 years. It established monitoring. It established consequences. And it contained one clause that was unlike any other clause in the document. Unlike, in fact, any clause that had ever been written into galactic law before, because no law had ever needed to address quite this situation. The clause was formal and dry in the way legal writing always is. But its meaning was simple. It said that no member of any signatory species was to initiate physical contact with a human being in a context of coercion, degradation, or dominance. It said that the consequences of such contact were recognized as inherently unpredictable. It said that full and complete legal responsibility for any outcome would rest with the party who initiated the contact. When the clause was read aloud in the hall, the Vorhai delegates looked at each other. One of them made the small chemical signal that in their language meant something close to, "At last." Someone wrote it down. After the signing, as the delegations began to file out into the corridor, a young Ketharak aide made his way across the room. He was young, barely into adulthood by his species measure, and he moved with the careful, self-conscious hesitation of someone who is doing something they were not sure they were supposed to do. He stopped in front of Darien. His Terran standard was careful and slow. He had clearly been practicing. "I watched the broadcast," he said, "on the day. I have thought about it many times." Darien waited. "I want to ask," the young aide said, "when he struck you, in that moment, what were you thinking?" It was a genuine question. There was no challenge in it, no politics. Just a young person who had watched something that had changed what they understood about the shape of the world, and who wanted to know what had been inside it. Darien considered the question carefully. He thought about the processing bay, and the smell of rust, and Vrethkal's hand coming down. He thought about the 1 second after, when everything in his body had been very clear and very quiet. "I thought," he said, "that he had no idea what I was." The young aide held that answer for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, like someone filing something away. He stepped back and moved into the crowd, and was gone. Darian walked out into the corridor. The station was full of people, delegates and advisors and observers and representatives of peoples who had come from very far away to sit in a room and hear their names said aloud as if they mattered, which they did, which they always had, which the galaxy was only now catching up to acknowledging. Out past the station's thick outer walls, space was the same as it had always been, dark and vast and full of distances that took years to cross. The same stars, the same silence, but the weight of things was different now. Not lighter exactly, not simpler. History never gets simpler. But the weight had shifted, redistributed, resettled into a new shape. The shape of a galaxy that had learned something it would not forget. The shape of peoples who had been told for a very long time that they were small, and who were beginning, carefully and with great seriousness, to stop believing it. The Terran Alliance's diplomatic shuttle was docked in Bay 7. Darian made his way there without hurrying. He had nowhere urgent to be, for the first time in a long while. And the corridor was wide, and the lights were warm. And somewhere in the middle distance, the Vorhai delegates were talking to the Shalith delegates, in the slow, careful way of people discovering that they have more in common than they expected. He listened for a moment, then kept walking. The galaxy breathed.